The scent of damp earth and rust was the new perfume of Xiao Zhan's life. In the Mingshan Valley, the leaky pipes were still fighting Wang Yibao's inexpert plumbing, and the uneven floor of their small house was littered with Zhan's draft poems and Yibao's tools. They were two masters of impossible crafts now dedicated to the clumsy joy of domestic failure. Zhan was finalizing his poetry collection, The Sound of Clumsy Joy, based on the submissions to the flawed archive, while Yibao wrestled with a perpetually dripping kitchen faucet. It was Sister Li, bursting into their flawed sanctuary, who brought the outside world back with a vengeance. She didn't need to speak. The look on her face, a mixture of outrage and resignation, spoke volumes. She held up her pristine, expensive tablet, the image on the screen a jarring contrast to the rustic setting. "They're making a move," she said, her voice tight. "The studio, the one that holds the rights to your biggest success, The Legend of Zang Hai." The Legend of Zang Hai was the mythical apex of Xiao Zhan's former idol life, a sprawling epic where his performance as the stoic, perfect swordsman, Zang Hai, had cemented his image as an unreachable ideal. Every frame was immaculate, every movement precise, every emotion controlled. It was the ultimate representation of the perfection he had run from. "They just released a celebratory reel for the 5th anniversary," Sister Li explained, flipping the tablet toward them. "They call it Zang Hai's Zero Error Zenith, the 100 Perfect Moments. It's a flawless, high-resolution, 1-hour loop of every single beautiful take, every flawless swing of the sword, every tear that fell at the exact, scripted second. It's a commercial weapon, Zhan. It screams, the perfection never left. You are still our product." Zhan felt a familiar coldness settle in his stomach, the ghost of the old fear. The past was not willing to let its perfect creation die. The flawless image of Zang Hai was now battling the rough reality of the man in the dirty hoodie and the tarnished ring. Yibao walked over, drying his rusty hands on a rag. He watched the real play. His friend, the person he saw struggling with a stubborn pipe or laughing over a burned meal, was transformed into an impossibly serene, distant god. "It's a perfect weapon because it's a perfect lie," Yibao observed, his fingers tracing the outline of the synesthetic memory weaver that sat charging on the desk. "They are fighting your truth with the illusion of your past truth. We must use the weaver to expose the true cost of that zenith." This was the first true confrontation of their new life, weaponizing vulnerability against the manufactured ideal. They took the weaver, the obsidian chess piece, and the reel into the darkest, coldest corner of the warehouse where they had first conceived the clumsy truth. Zhan loaded the perfect, edited reel onto a large screen, and Yibao set up the weaver, connecting it via a conductive wire to the ring on Zhan's hand. "We need to feel the moment behind the take," Yibao instructed, his face illuminated by the bright, flawless light of the projected scene. "When Zang Hai delivers that perfect, tear-stained line about duty, what was Zhan actually feeling?" Zhan pressed his hand against the screen, the silver ring acting as the conduit. The scene of the perfect tear began to play, Zang Hai, kneeling in the rain, delivering a monologue of stoic grief. On the screen, the tear rolled down his cheek with agonizing, cinematic beauty, hitting the dirt at the exact, designated moment. But through the weaver, the sensory data that flooded Zhan's mind and Yibao's connected awareness was terrifying. The light in the room shifted, not to rain, but to a blinding, relentless studio spot, radiating raw heat. Zhan didn't feel scripted grief. He felt the visceral, burning pain of extreme dehydration and the crushing, dizzying exhaustion of having worked 72 hours straight. The weaver translated the internal emotional data onto the walls, projecting the chaotic reality behind the serene image, a blurred, shaky overlay of the director screaming about continuity, the bitter taste of chemical rain effects, and the sharp, piercing stab of physical hunger. The perfect, cinematic moment was revealed to be a simple, physiological failure masked by flawless editing. "My perfect tear," Zhan whispered, pulling his hand away, shaking. "It wasn't duty. It was just fatigue and hunger forcing my body to weep." The emotion was true, but the reason was a brutal flaw. They repeated the process for the flawless sword swing, the scene where Zang Hai executes an impossible aerial maneuver. Yibao, touching the weaver, felt not heroic energy, but the sudden, sharp, internal snap of a torn shoulder muscle, followed by the frantic application of pain-killing patches and the quiet, professional dread of knowing he couldn't perform the next take without risking permanent injury. The perfection was achieved through a hidden, agonizing cost. They catalogued 100 moments of perfection, each one revealing a hidden, ugly flaw beneath. The zero-error Zenith was built entirely on hidden error, pain, and exhaustion. The studio's next move, however, was designed to completely bypass emotional truth. The same afternoon, the studio unveiled its counterstrike to the destruction of the Ares 9. They announced they were collaborating with a high-profile technology firm to create the world's first zero-error digital replica, ZEDR, of the destroyed race car. The announcement was accompanied by a terrifyingly real, three-dimensional hologram projected over the desolate salt flats where the Ares 9 was crushed. The ZEDR was perfect, a flawless, gleaming digital twin of Eba's race car, built with impossible physics and eternal speed. Mr. Wang Eba destroyed the machine, the studio spokesperson declared, standing beside the glowing, spectral car. We have rebuilt its image, forever erasing his act of chaos. We will now launch the ZEDR as a revolutionary new digital asset, symbolizing the ultimate, achievable perfection of human endeavor. This digital machine, unlike the flawed man, will never stumble. The digital clone was the ultimate threat too. It was untouchable, immortal, and utterly without flaw. It was the commercial world declaring that physical reality, and its clumsy truth, was obsolete. The ZDR was the perfect lie made digital. Eba watched the broadcast, his hands curling into fists. They are trying to replace the honest struggle with a smooth, virtual lie, he said, his voice hard. We must contaminate their perfection with our truth. Zhan looked at the weaver, then at the rough drafts of his poetry. We can't fight their perfection with our perfection. We fight it with the ugliest truth of Zang Hai. The counterstrike was immediate. Zhan and Eba leveraged the network of the flawed archive and Sister Li's remaining influence. They didn't produce a documentary or an interview. They produced a digital transmission of pure flaw. The title of their broadcast, which broke into every major platform stream, was simple: Zang Hai, the usable failures. The final scene began with a single, shocking sound of ragged, exhausted breathing, the audio track of Zhan's near-collapse during the perfect tear scene, recorded directly from the weaver. The Mingshan house was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. The leak in the kitchen sink was now managed by a spectacular, Rube Goldberg-esque arrangement of buckets and mismatched tubing, all stubbornly held together by Wang Eba's imperfect, yet functional, plumbing work. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in the living room sagged under the weight of the sound of clumsy joy. Zhan's published book of poetry based on the flawed archive submissions, a commercial failure and a cultural phenomenon. The quiet, domestic rhythm was shattered one morning by the arrival of a massive, heavy-duty flatbed truck. It carried a single item, shrouded in canvas, the final form of the Ares 9. Sister Li, who had coordinated the delivery, peeled back the canvas to reveal the crushed cube. It was not a pile of scrap, it was a brutally beautiful cube of compressed, melted, and resolidified carbon fiber, titanium, and exotic alloys. The destruction had been so complete, and the pressure so extreme, that the cube's surface was polished, jagged, and cold, a flawless, abstract monolith of zero-error technology transformed into a zero-error piece of junk. Even in death, the Ares 9 was perfectly terrifying. It's too clean, Eba, Zhan murmured, tracing the jagged edge of the cube. Even as scrap, it's still an idol. It's unusable. It's too expensive to melt again, too perfect to discard. It mocks the entire point of the archive. Eba nodded, his eyes narrowed. He recognized the problem. The ultimate pursuit of perfection leaves an indelible mark, even on failure. The cube was a monument to the cost of the lie, but it didn't embody the freedom of the truth. It needs to serve the flaw, Eba determined. It needs a purpose so utterly unsuited to its nature that its perfection is permanently defeated by its function. But the immediate challenge was not the cube, it was the inevitable, encroaching future. The success of the flawed archive meant the world was now eager for their next, authentic move. Offers for small, prestigious projects, teaching roles, small theater productions, design commissions, were piling up. These roles were not the gilded cage of the past, but they carried a subtle, dangerous poison, the expectation of flawless authenticity. The world now expected them to be perfectly imperfect. This pressure drove Eba to the synesthetic memory weaver. He spent a week in his workshop, a converted shed, now smelling less of oil and more of flux and soldering iron, rewiring the obsidian device. The weaver's original function was retrospective. It could replay a memory and expose the flaw that preceded the perfect result. Eba's new function was chronometric contamination. The new function required a moment of complete commitment from Zhan. The greatest pressure on Zhan was the idea of giving the commencement speech at the Mingshan Institute's final graduation, a small, intimate, but highly symbolic event. It was his chance to deliver his philosophy to a new generation. The students expected an emotional, flawless articulation of Zhua Shi. Zhan agreed to use the weaver to protect the moment. They stood in the empty lecture hall, the vast space smelling of chalk, dust, and hopeful futures. Eba prepared the weaver, focusing its projection beam not onto the wall, but onto a specialized quantum entanglement receiver that Eba claimed could project the sensory data forward in time. "We are projecting the ideal, perfect version of your future speech, Zhang Eba explained, his hand steady on the controls. "The one where your voice is clear, your message is moving, and the students weep with inspiration. We are creating the perfect, terrifying success." Zhan, wearing the tarnished silver ring, closed his eyes and summoned the ideal moment, the speech where he nailed the philosophy, the moment of pure, transcendent connection with the students. As he did so, the lecture hall was suddenly filled with the ghost of the future. The lighting changed to the soft, golden light of the graduation day. They heard the sound of perfect, swelling applause. Zhan felt the rush of flawless delivery, the intellectual clarity, the pure, unedited joy of successful communication. The projection was so real that the air tasted of the celebratory champagne they hadn't yet drunk. This was the perfect future, the one the media would consume. Then, Eba activated the contamination. He didn't inject pain or sadness. He injected pure clumsiness. Eba had recorded the sound of the leaky faucet in their kitchen at its absolute, most frustrating pitch. He had recorded the feeling of the rough sandpaper against his fingertips as he accidentally scraped his knuckle during plumbing. And he had recorded the specific, ridiculous laughter they had shared when he accidentally glued his boot to the floor. Eba hit the execution key. The perfect future shattered. The applause track was instantly contaminated by the loud, intrusive, rhythmic sound of the leaky faucet. Asterisk drip, drip, drip asterisk, a relentless, embarrassing metronome against the speech. Zhan felt the phantom sensation of sandpaper roughness across his tongue, making it impossible to form smooth, eloquent words. And then, the ultimate contamination. The entire projected audience, in their perfect future clothes, was overcome by a wave of inexplicable, bubbling, inappropriate laughter. Zhan stumbled, pulling away from the perfect future, blinking in the real, dusty silence of the empty hall. "What was that?" Zhan whispered, his throat tight. "That was the clumsy truth defending your future," Eba explained, disconnecting the weaver. "Now, when you go to deliver that speech, a tiny, subconscious part of you will always hear the leaky faucet, always feel the awkwardness, and always be prepared to laugh when the speech goes wrong. You cannot be perfectly successful at that moment, because we have guaranteed its flaw." The weaver was now their ultimate defense, a technological shield against the subtle, relentless pressure of external expectation. With the threat of future perfection managed, they turned to the Ares 9 cube. They decided the cube had to be melted down, but not for art, for function. It would not be beautiful, it would be useful. They built a small, crude furnace in their backyard, using local clay and the remaining fragments of the Ares IX's own discarded casing as insulation. The cube itself was the fuel. The smelting process was the most brutal, mind-blowing act of deconstruction yet. The ultra-high-performance alloys resisted the heat, forcing them to use an enormous amount of raw, messy thermal energy. The clean lines of the cube glowed with an internal white-hot ferocity, finally surrendering its structural integrity to the clumsy, overwhelming force of fire. The resulting liquid metal was not poured into an elegant mold. Instead, Eba had created a series of rough, porous, imperfect clay molds, each one designed to be inherently flawed, ensuring the resulting metal would be pocked, scarred, and asymmetrical. They poured the glowing, liquid metal into the molds, the metal hissing and spitting against the uneven clay. The final product was 1,000 small, rough, heavy discs, each one scarred with pits, bumps, and asymmetrical edges. They were ugly, honest, and utterly lacking in market value. Zhan picked one up. It was cold, heavy, and raw. "What are these?" "The new currency of the archive," Eba declared, his face smudged with soot and pride. "They are zero-error weights,